Welcome, everyone, to the Security Best Practices for Amazon End User Computing. We affectionately call end user computing EUC. Sometimes I casually toss that term around. So just going forward, let's call it AWS EUC for everyone attending. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to start with a short little introduction on who I am and what kind of background that I have. Like I said, my name is Stephen K. Stetler. I've been with Amazon Web Services now a little over a year. And in that time, I've been fortunate to have got many of these certifications here. Not really that big of a deal to me personally. It's more of just a validation of all the work predecessed this whole career here at AWS. I worked for APN, that's the Amazon Partner Network, a couple of companies, and had the fortune of an EUC specific focus for the last 6 years. If you go back, that meant that I was actually involved in the first BYOL, which is Bring Your Own License, Windows 7 migration to Amazon WorkSpaces. It was a big deal at the time, and sort of caught the bug for AWS EUC, and I've been ever so excited to be part of this journey ever since. And what you find when you go down this journey, maybe you'll go down this journey with me, who knows? But when I went through it, I found that I wasn't just working in EUC. A lot of the fundamental building blocks of AWS EUC products include, well, all the basics of AWS. So if you're familiar with VPCs, EC2, and then databases, you start touching a lot of other services, and it makes sense. When you're building a managed service, you build it with whatever is available to build with. So all these fully managed EUC services we're going to be covering today are started from the fundamental building blocks of what you know today affectionately on AWS. I am a senior specialist EUC solutions architect, and what that means is this is all I do. I am much focused on not only promoting customers' architecture of AWS EUC, but I'm also doing my best to promote EUC internally with my colleagues here at AWS, educating and building the best of the best. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. So again, I find it's very important to get a very broad understanding of AWS as we build out new features in the platform. Knowing all of these things will only make it easier as time goes on. If you want to reach out to me on Twitter, by the way, my Twitter handle is Stevie Stets. Little nickname I had in high school. It's kind of stuck with me. And my son is also named Steven. I call him Stevie Stets. It's a little cute thing we do. So that is enough you need to know about me. So what will we cover today? We'll start out with what our mission for AWS EUC is. And as I'm sure you could guess, given the title of this webinar, our mission is to deliver AWS EUC securely. Securely is the only way to deliver it. It's the only way to scale, and it's the only way to be agile with EUC. Believe me, I've done hundreds of implementations. If security isn't at the beginning of your journey on EUC, very hard to add later, as anybody who's worked in this field can attest to. We'll cover the best practices topics. Some of this should be familiar with AWS veterans. Account strategy, the structure of how you build out your traditional landing zones and such. Yeah, this comes along for the ride with AWS EUC too. Remember, I did say that it's very important to think about those building blocks, bringing them over to this realm. That's why when you're starting out in AWS, you get those basic certifications in architecture and DevOps because you need to understand these basic concepts to really succeed in AWS EUC beyond, right, the basics. You'll notice as a fully managed service, though, you could kick the tires and sort of just inherit all that security that's in those fundamentals. It's important, though, that we always continue to evolve and see the art of the possible. And that's why I say just keep going on this learning journey with me. IAM roles, very important, because the type of administration that you have for each service will likely be overlapping in other services. So we're going to cover those and beyond. Identity providers. Certainly, there's two forms of identity. You have the identity for administration, then you have your general user identities. How do you secure them? Networking. My goodness, we could talk about networking for a full hour. We don't have that long to just talk about one topic, but I'm going to do the best I can to get you familiarized with all the tools in our arsenal. Encryption, at rest, in transit, monitoring, because monitoring is needed by everyone all the time, as well as auditing. We'll cover some customer stories. I'll point out some additional resources just to get you started. Believe me, it's just the beginning. And then we'll cover some questions you might have. So let's start with our mission. Deliver the ability to securely get work done from anywhere, from any device. I'm actually talking to you right now in October. And if you're listening to this in October, it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So just a little fun factoid I wanted to throw in there. If you're listening to this in October, that is awesome. Thank you so much. Let's continue that security trend and really focus on our ability to get work done securely when we're working from home during a pandemic, or maybe that's just how we've always worked. But we want to be able to use any device and not compromise on our security. And that's where Amazon WorkSpaces and Amazon AppStream 2.0 have always been built. We were ready for any kind of situation. Nobody looks forward to a pandemic, of course, but we're prepared for it. Now, just like if you're coming from EUC, you understand other services, how you have non-persistent and persistent workloads, you'll notice that, hey, we address those as well, whether it's just applications that you're presenting or full-on desktop. You are not going to compromise on the type of requirements that you have just to deliver or extend your end user computing to your users, wherever they are, remotely. But it's ambient. And what I mean by that is it permeates every aspect of these services. You don't have to turn on anything specific to inherit encryption, for instance, or streaming pixels, leaving everything remotely in the data center, no data touching the local device. That's just going to be delivered as part of the value of the service. It's just securely part of it. So let's go to the very start of these best practices topics. Account structure. Folks, if you don't have an AWS organization and some implementation of Control Tower or a landing zone, I really urge you to start there. And there's a good reason. We'll cover the type of permissions that an administrator for WorkSpaces or AppStream would need. But at a very high level, I want to be very clear, the type of administrator that is administering productivity apps would not necessarily need the same permissions as an administrator of WorkSpaces or AppStream, right? We don't want to overlap those roles. However, there may be instances where an administrator may need to touch some of those productivity apps while administering all of WorkSpaces. But to keep them in separate accounts allows some greater control of your account permissions. But regardless, you do want all of your auditing and monitoring logs, your configuration, and your billing to go to a centralized account that somebody who is in charge of those things has access to, right? And that is where AWS organizations with Control Tower kind of set all this in motion for you. Everything funnels up to that payer account. The people that are in charge of auditing will only have access to that payer account. They can make sure that you are complying with all of the organizational policies and security from that payer account without having to go in and touch the workspaces. Likewise, a workspace administrator doesn't have to obsess over logging, configuration, billing, and things like that. They simply just make sure that once this structure is followed, you could go from there. I urge you, if you're not familiar, most EUC administrators are not familiar with AWS organizations and Control Tower, go check it out, learn some of this stuff, and then we'll talk about what's next is why it's so incredibly important, because the type of permissions will vary. If you're not familiar, by the way, with shared services is something that I urge all customers and anyone that's looking into a more mature sort of way of managing their cloud at scale, getting those services like domain controllers, DNS, file shares, any other type of service that all of your regional activities would share in, having that shared services available, regardless, administration, right? You don't necessarily want your EUC administrators administering domain controllers, right? So again, now you're seeing that split. That doesn't mean that a domain administrator can't go into the workspaces. I mean, that's very different. Security of the cloud versus security in the cloud. Understanding that as well, the responsibility model. If you're not familiar with the responsibility model, also please check that out. But it's very important that we bifurcate those cloud management type operational roles. Like I promised, we're going to cover IAM roles. This is a very common type of implementation. You will know that your organization may have more advanced than this, but let's just get started at the basics. A workspaces administrator, for instance, just to perform basic fundamental type activities, they're going to need access to the workspaces service, KMS, directory services. Workspaces is fundamentally built on directory services, and we'll talk about why that's an important distinction to make. Whereas AppStream, you don't need directory services. As a matter of fact, AppStream 2.0 doesn't even use directory services. That doesn't mean it can't join an Active Directory, but it's different. And CloudWatch is so important to getting AppStream right due to the scaling nature of resources. You could already see, just because these two services are solving different problems, they have different building blocks assigned to them. So incredibly important is that we only give the type of services access to the administrator because we're following least privilege. Now, that doesn't mean that CloudWatch doesn't have a purpose in workspaces. As you'll see, there are a lot of metrics that are available for workspaces administrators to follow, like round trip time of the protocol. It's very important if the user has connected, if they fail their connections. But not every workspaces administrator is going to need that type of access. But then you get into the architecture, and now we're talking about those building blocks, right? VPC, the subnets that they have available for the workspaces to be launched into, the routing, right? And later on, other networking security paradigms that we'll discuss, EC2, because those are going to inherit a lot of those properties. Now, AppStream, on the other hand, due to its non-persistent nature, we need a way to persist some user data sometimes. Not every implementation needs it, but AppStream 2.0 administrators will likely need access to S3 and the resource policies assigned to it. I need to make sure that I can store user data, whether it's a home folder or a application settings persistence VHD to that S3. FSX for Windows File Server, very commonly used. You go beyond your basic requirements for user persistence. Now I need an entire user container, something that is flexible, that grows, that I can attach real time as I'm authenticating, because I have large caches, right? Now I'm needing some permissions to FSX for Windows File Server, and then beyond. Of course, VPC, EC2. I am in two strategic ways. The implementation of SAML 2.0 identity providers necessitates that you establish that trust with IAM. Additionally, IAM can be used for service roles because just like EC2, AppStream 2.0 will allow service role access. I know what you're thinking. If I have a AppStream user that is sort of doing some kind of development work and needs to access the DynamoDB table, why not set up a VPC endpoint and give that that AppStream fleet the role for IAM, the service role, to access DynamoDB? We could secure it in multiple ways. And of course, because this is security best practices, I'm telling you that IAM is very strategic for advanced architect configurations of AppStream. This is not your everyday consideration. However, we need to go secure in the cloud more. IAM is a critical component to it. And I think you can see why that's really important to keep AppStream in its own account, because that consideration alone is huge. IAM necessitates a lot of access. At that point, containing the blast radius of somebody getting access to that role is something that as a UC administrator, you must be very, very cognizant of. One last thing that I will note, if you want to go beyond and look at the usage reports of AppStream 2.0, you'll be looking at services like AWS Glue, as well as Athena. So that means really be sure up front what your requirements are so that you can create the IAM permissions necessary to be successful. Do yourself a favor and always architect. I'm going to go back a couple slides with the different services in their own accounts so that if new requirements come up, you're not going, well, now I got to give an administrator access to something that was really not supposed to be in this account because I have productivity applications or shared services, and now they have access to that, which goes against my original plan. So always keep them in separate accounts. Therefore, you don't really worry about it, right? You take the stress off, and you've architected not just to scale, but to keep your security in line. Identity providers, I mean, that is the name of the game. That's where our users come from. And it's important to take a look at the overview of these services because the way we handle identity providers just is a little different between WorkSpaces and AppStream. So take a look here at Amazon WorkSpaces overview. You see the authentication gateway is certainly not something that you're going to manage, but it's public facing. So that means that we need a way to bring it into your customer account to communicate with your domain controller because WorkSpaces is a managed service in that way, built on Active Directory. So think about the fact that this authentication gateway is public. You're going to need different considerations because it's not managed by you. We're certainly going to keep it encrypted. We're going to protect it, but you have to think about your accounts in a way that you're not thinking about it maybe today. These user accounts, if somebody leaves a password on a sticky note, the fact that this authentication gateway is just sitting out there publicly means you're going to do more than just make them require their Active Directory user name and password. You're probably going to require at least an additional means of second factor of authentication at a minimum, because again, it's sitting there public. And then you look at your AppStream and you don't even see an authentication gateway there, right? Because fundamentally, you manage that gateway, whether it's a user pool identity, which, by the way, at scale is never going to be a best practice, right? API driven, you've programmatically built this, you're an ISV, and you want to supply users with your application. So you have your own identity platform, or maybe it's anonymous, but you're programmatically issuing a streaming resource to those users. Again, that's something you manage. That's something you build. Or lastly, a SAML 2.0 identity provider, which is what you see here, interacting with that secure token provider to our secure token service. That's why you see a token being exchanged between the user and the identity provider. Identity provider does not have to be on premises, of course. It could be anywhere in the cloud. It could be your Oktas, if you will. You have a lot of flexibility. Traditionally, it's in the internet. If you're doing everything on premises, maybe it's Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS, but they're all provisioning accounts from Active Directory, generally speaking. We don't have to use Active Directory as SAML 2.0, but we can. And that's also true of AppStream. We don't have to use Active Directory, but we can. Again, that's for your non-persistent workloads. But you can see right here, going back, I have an authentication gateway with WorkSpaces. I don't have one with AppStream. And that's important when we start to break down these authentication differences. Regardless of what you're doing, WorkSpaces is built on Active Directory. Whether you bring it up as Microsoft Managed AD, an AWS service, or it's your customer, you're bringing this up, you're using what is called an AD connector, which is a non-caching proxy. I'll repeat, AD connectors are non-caching proxies. That means we're not caching anything. We're just simply proxying your authentication requests to your Active Directory domain controllers. So that becomes a big component. If we could go back to that drawing real quick, you see the authentication gateway speaks to the AD connector on the right, which is in red, and then it has a network interface in your VPC. Whether that domain controller is in your VPC or on premises, it doesn't really matter. The point is it's got a route to get to that domain controller. But I'd be remiss to not mention that domain controllers absolutely should be in your VPC. Whether it's a lateral VPC or it's in the same VPC, my point is that it's available in that region. Think of it this way, folks. Would you build a data center and not have domain controllers? Would you have everything go across your WAN? Maybe you would. But at scale, that gets harder and harder to be very effective at. My recommendation, our best practice, put domain controllers in the region. Add another Active Directory site, and then make sure that those subnets can communicate with it. But we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Same could be said for AppStream 2.0. At the end of the day, folks, regardless of workspaces or AppStream, these are just Windows instances. So Windows instances, just by joining an Active Directory domain, need things like group policies and DFS namespace resolution. And we could go on, right? There is a lot at stake with the communication between domain controllers and those instances. So while it's not required for AppStream, it's certainly optional. I will always tell you, please put domain controllers in that AWS region. Now, I'm sorry for harping on that so much. I just wanted to continually bring that to your attention. Workspaces, like I said, put a second factor of authentication on it. That gateway is public. With Workspaces today, that is radius only. If you don't want to use radius, there's additional security measures. You can issue client-based certificates to your connecting devices. And then if they don't have a certificate, then it will fail the login, right? Because that's another way of authenticating. IP-based, meaning IP control access lists. What that means is you're either allowed or denied. Very hard to do, by the way, with working from home users. So generally not something we see. That's your call centers, right? If you have a call center from another country and you always know they're coming from that building where they have to work, you know the public IP addresses. Maybe you create an allow list and you just say workspace can only be accessed from those locations. And by the way, there is a CloudWatch event to capture a JSON payload of all the information of the connecting device. Bring that to your attention. We'll talk about some of the things you could do with that at another time, but it might start to get your mind thinking, what are some of the things? And by the way, as a Workspaces administrator, maybe I want to request access to CloudWatch so I can kind of envision all those things, right? And see them out into reality. OS-based, I can decide if I want to allow these types of devices. Maybe I don't want to allow Mac devices because I know those type of devices don't exist for my connecting users. So I just uncheck that box. And by the way, that's at the directory level. Smart card authentication is something that is specific to WSP, which is the Workspaces Streaming Protocol. If you have a Workspaces Streaming Protocol, you can do pre-session authentication with a smart card. And the way it works is it has to be a common access card or private identity verification card. You insert the card in, and the smart card reader will then send information to the Workspaces client. Time to enter your PIN. The PIN will decrypt that X509 certificate, and of course, the authentication is relayed through the public internet, encrypted, of course, TLS 1.2. But something to think about, if you have smart cards in your organization, maybe consider looking at WSP and including that as a factor of authentication. It's not in all regions just yet, and I'll leave a link to the regions that are available. And it's also included in our best practices guide. But when you talk about AppStream, multi-factor, that may have more to do with your identity provider. If that's something you build internally, or if it's a SAML 2.0 identity provider, you know what types of multi-factors available today because you probably use it already. That's why for customers, when they ask, what can I do with AppStream 2.0? I say, what are you doing today? Keep doing it, right? That is the easiest way. And that's why AppStream 2.0 is very popular with a lot of our customers. You can have conditional security features that extend way beyond what we can build, because this is all those identity providers do. The time you're connecting, the location, basically maybe schedules that they've worked out. All this stuff exists with AppStream 2.0 because it exists with your identity provider. That's all they do. So leveraging that is going to be a great way to move forward. Again, you don't have to have Active Directory domain joined AppStream fleets to leverage SAML 2.0 identity provider. But if you have an Active Directory domain joined fleet, you must use SAML 2.0 identity provider. Getting that right. So let's go to network. And I talk about network all day long. I love networking. It's certainly, if I were in college for AWS, networking would be my minor. So let's just talk about the basics of your best practices for security in the VPC, right? Use multiple AZs. IAM policies, wherever possible, must be secured for the type of access that you get. CloudWatch, turning that on the flow logs, VPC flow logs, DNS flow logs, all the logs, turn them on, right? Just make sure you have all of that turned on. That's your basics. And if you go to the VPC best practices, you're going to see those listed there. So let's talk about, though, that second network interface that exists on both WorkSpaces and AppStream. If you remember the architecture, right, we had a second network interface that goes into your customer account. And that's where those managed instances will show up in your VPC, right? The managed instances for fleets and AppStream and WorkSpaces, those are in AWS managed accounts. That's why we call it a managed service. But in the same availability zone as that managed services instances are a secondary network interface. I had a customer recently ask me, when I turn on a VPN client in my workspace, I get disconnected. Well, it's obvious to somebody that sees the architecture from an AWS perspective, not somebody who just creates virtual machines, for instance. When you start looking at the cloud and you bifurcate what is on the customer side versus what is on the AWS side, that's basically that management network interface in the service team side. Having that change routing is going to break the service. You're not going to be able to stream with that first network interface. It's not going to be able to communicate with the management backplane. So any kind of changes we're making here, we're talking about that second network interface. So my guidance, of course, to that customer was, this is a best practice anyway. Apply your VPN client only to the second network interface, and everything will work fine. We have tools right out of the box because we built on VPC and subnets. Be familiar to you with the security group, the network ACL. The security group for WorkSpaces, it's automatically created when you create the directory. Don't delete it, right? If you delete it, you're going to break it. But you can add a second security group to that directory. So in your head, you're probably thinking, okay, so any workspace that I launch in that directory will inherit all these security groups, those two security groups. And that's true. But because these are just security groups and these are just ENIs, you could go to the ENI and attach an additional security group if you want to. But that becomes very hard to do at scale. You're just going in and individually attaching security groups. That's why we offer that second option in the directory. Now, as for AppStream fleets, we could select our security groups when we're bringing up the fleet. My recommendation is always do not allow inbound in your security group, which, by the way, WorkSpaces don't, the default security group. Outbound, we allow all traffic because, like it says here, it's a stateful firewall. So anything that you send out will implicitly be allowed in because the request originated from the workspace. That security group remembers that. NACLs are different, of course, and they're launched in the subnets. So WorkSpaces inherently, unless you have a reason to make changes to the network ACLs that are created with the subnet, or if you add additional network ACLs, I generally try to stay away from them because it becomes another thing to troubleshoot when connections fail. Again, you have your VPC flow logs where you can look and see if something is getting denied or allowed. I highly recommend you resort to those flow logs when you need to review why connections aren't working the way you believe they should be. Again, network ACLs are attached at the subnet. So it's going to be after or before, depending upon the direction of where your ENI sits. And then lastly, I included this AWS Network Firewall, and I love the AWS Network Firewall. I love all third-party firewalls because as AWS EUC services matured and customers' requirements matured, we saw a lot of customers saying things like, we need intrusion detection and prevention. We need ways to create a basic place to perform inspection, an inspection network, if you will, on all this traffic that's coming in and out of workspaces and AppStream. Why is that so important, you might ask? It's very important because they are doing all these calls out to the public internet. We don't know where our users are connecting to. The alternative is that we just send all of our internet-bound traffic, our internet egress, through our direct connect to on-premises because we have state-of-the-art firewalls there that are performing all this auditing. And, well, if you think about it, that's a lot of back and forth. That's a lot of going out the VPC to on-premises, then back in for your internet traffic. And it makes sense that AWS has such incredible internet bandwidth. When you attach that IGW and you go out that IGW, there's no stopping you, right? You're on Easy Street. You're flying. You're going 1,000,000 miles an hour. So having the ability to replicate those state-of-the-art firewalls for your intrusion detection and prevention, to perform auditing on what users are connecting to what public sites are, that should they even be allowed to do that, right? As well as doing some server name inspection, SNI, and then blocking and allowing certain FQDNs. Maybe you don't want your users on Facebook. So what you do is you create a stateless rule that will block it. But there's a blog that talks about the kinds of things you could do with AWS Network Firewall when it comes to AWS EUC that I've included in here. It's great because you can either do it just in your VPC, or you can have a centralized deployment where every VPC that you bring up will just route to that through transit gateway. And it really allows you to scale very securely, quickly. That's why you go to AWS EUC, is the agility is not impacted by the security. From an OSI layer, that's where that network firewall shines. It's you could go all the way up to layer 7, right? So you got your application layer, you got your presentation layer. It's all there. So if you're going beyond L3 and L4 traditional firewalls that you have at AWS. Now, security groups and NACLs, network ACLs, come at no cost because they're just part of running a VPC. However, with AWS Network Firewall, there is an hourly charge as well as a gigabyte charge. I would like to add that this may vary per region, and your NAC gateway charge is no longer included when you use AWS Network Firewall as of this recording. So this could be a little deceiving when you see there's no charge for a security group and NACL. That's true, but you're probably going to still have a NAC gateway or a NAT instance or a set of NAT instances you manage. So it's really important to think about what it is that you're trying to achieve here, because if you're going to route to on-premise, there's going to be a cost for that as well, where your firewalls exist today. If you're not going to use AWS Network Firewall and you're going to use a firewall from the AWS Marketplace that you already have licensing, or you want to subscribe for licensing, obviously there's a cost there. I guess what I'm saying is nothing is truly free, but it's always best to figure out what are your requirements and work backwards from there. And then maybe you'll see what solution or combination of solutions will work best for you. Don't forget NAT gateway and VPC endpoints wherever possible. I talked about it earlier. NAT gateways, this should go without saying. Don't put your workspaces or your AppStream fleet instances in public subnets. I'm not saying NAT gateway is the be-all, end-all for your internet egress, but at least it obscures resources from connecting to these devices or these endpoints from the public. We want to prevent inbound-based connections wherever possible. In the VPC, that's true, but especially true from the public internet. And then VPC endpoints is your highway, if you will, to your AWS resource services at large, S3, DynamoDB, and then maybe you're using other features like machine learning. You have all kinds of things you could be accessing inside of AWS services. Use VPC endpoints and resource policies wherever possible. And then actually, it's probably not a bad idea. I recommend reading up on many of our hybrid DNS guides and learning that. Because remember, with Active Directory, DNS is the lifeblood of Active Directory. But if you're creating VPC endpoint interfaces that have specific EC2 internal addresses, you're going to need a way to forward those requests to the correct VPC resolvers. So read that hybrid DNS guide when you get a chance. And I'll end on that note for networking. And let's move on, because we must move on to data encryption. We start at the start of in transit. What am I going to say here? Encryption is just part of these protocols, whether we're talking authentication with TLS 1.2, whether we're talking PC over IP made by Teradici, that's the default protocol that we use for workspaces, or like I said earlier, workspaces streaming protocol, WSP. These are both encrypted AES 256-bit encryption, but you don't have to do anything for that. Likewise with AppStream 2.0, the nice DCV protocol that we own, great protocol. It goes through the web browser very smoothly. Again, that's encrypted. I don't need to turn this on or off. This is just the ambient security that AWS EUC offers. It's just there. Now, WorkSpaces does have that public streaming gateway, and I think you saw that in the diagram. Underneath the WorkSpaces authentication gateway, we had the streaming gateway. Now, that is just a public endpoint. You may ask, why can't I route to it from my VPC? And the simple answer is there is no routing between the account that AWS manages for the workspace instances and the endpoints and the customer VPC where those ENIs are. We don't route between them. We keep a very clear distinction between those two environments because it's public only, and both WSP and PC over IP are UDP-based protocols, which, by the way, is fantastic for real-time streaming. You want UDP, right? I digress. It's so important that you make sure when you're accessing this that you're only allowing the right users. Okay, so that part we've covered. But the public-only nature of this, and these are UDP-based protocols, means that we are not able to use private link, AWS private link. You might think of it like, well, you just said earlier, what about VPC endpoints? And by the way, it's true for AppStream, but it's not true for workspaces because WSP and PC over IP are UDP-based protocols, and private link only supports TCP-based protocols. So that means that nice DCV, like I said earlier, is encrypted, works over the web browser. That is TCP-based currently. So you can have a private endpoint. So you can stream it through your direct connect using a VPC endpoint. Workspaces, if you wanted to force the traffic through the direct connect, we could do it the same way people used to do S3 through the internet, through the direct connect. And that's by creating a public VIF. If you're very familiar with the difference between private VIFs and public VIFs are really for those endpoint services that are only available by Amazon publicly. So that still means you're going to have to go to your direct connect location before going out to the public internet. You're still accessing it through the public internet. One thing that I will tell you is, look, there is no security benefit to accessing workspaces through a direct connect. There's none. You're not doing it for that. The reason you're probably doing it is because the locations that your users are just simply don't have public internet access, but they part of an MPLS that will eventually connect to a direct connect. Okay, but it's not security because, again, these protocols are completely encrypted. And even if you try to man in the middle them, you're not going to get anything. Because remember, at the end of the day, even if it was possible to break the encryption, we're not transmitting any data. There is no files getting transmitted over the wire here. So I say it's Cybersecurity Month. We want to be secure as possible, but I'm still telling you there is no security benefit to going through a direct connect. Now, there are additional virtual channels that you can egress through these services, but you decide. You make the determination. Do you want to allow clipboard? Do you want to allow printing? And by the way, there's a little bit of delineation in there. What type of clipboard direction you want to allow? Do you want to allow it back and forth, right? Do you want it to go one direction versus the other? Do you want to allow both directions printing? And then AppStream 2.0 will actually allow some uploading and downloading if you turn it on. But that's up to you. That's something you have to decide. At rest workspaces, the client, right? There's no data on the client. We already talked about this. AppStream is not really applicable here. But think about workspaces, the persistent nature, these volumes, right? It's EBS in the background. You can absolutely encrypt those volumes with the key management service. Again, that's why I said in the beginning of this, you're probably going to turn this on, because when the user's done using the workspace and it stops, we want to make sure it's encrypted and nobody can access it. We'll assign a KMS key to the workspace. It's a best practice for your users to have KMS encrypted workspaces. AppStream 2.0 instances are ephemeral, however, because they're non-persistent. The user ends the session, the instance is immediately terminated. What we really care about at that point is what information that we want to persist, that gets encrypted. And that's where we look at your S3, your G Drive, because we have support for Google Drive, your Microsoft OneDrive, your Windows file servers. How are you encrypting them? Think about that. Those are separate from the service. But like I said, it's really hard to do AWS EUC and just think of, well, I'm just going to be the best EUC administrator I can be. No, you need to think beyond that, because these other services are used, and now securing them becomes part of your responsibility. So looking at the ways that S3 performs encryption with the server-side encryption options, the KMS options, that's all there. Google Drive and OneDrive have their ways of doing it. If you're using FSX for Windows File Server, we cover this in the AppStream Best Practices document with considerations for securing Windows File Server as well. Lastly, we're going to talk about monitoring and tracking and auditing, all very important things, because without an audit trail, what good is, how can I prove that I've secured my environment? WorkSpaces and AppStream do both keep everything in CloudTrail. Every action, everything you do is logged. And if you set up your control tower, like I showed in the very first slide, you know that those CloudTrail logs really, as a best practice, should be going up to that payer account so it can be audited there as well. So nobody goes in as administrator and makes changes to the CloudTrail logs in the WorkSpaces account. It's already been copied up to the payer account. We know from a valid standpoint that no changes have been made, that these are the changes to the WorkSpaces and AppStream services as well. The service level metrics, it's really interesting that CloudWatch metrics are available for both, but for different types. I urge you to check out the metrics available for WorkSpaces versus AppStream. With WorkSpaces, it's really about the quality of each individual user's connection. Did they connect? Did they have a connection failure? What the round trip time for the protocol was? Did they have, if there's directory integrations, any kind of issues there? Looking at client-based certificate failures. We're capturing all that information. On the AppStream side, well, the CloudWatch metrics are really about auto-scaling. And I would say one of the most important things as an AppStream 2.0 administrator, regardless of what your scale is, you're always thinking about, am I scaling resources to users in a efficient way? Am I making them wait too long? Am I scaling ahead of the demand to prepare for it? Because by the way, when I start my auto scaling, it could take 10 to 15 minutes for that resource to go from pending to available, thus allowing the user to connect. Am I leveraging scheduled scaling policies? Am I running into insufficient capacity? Is my demand outweighing my total capacity? Really, CloudWatch metrics are all about capturing that information. You want your available capacity to meet your demand at wherever possible. So your total capacity and your in-use capacity should be pretty close. They shouldn't be identical, because now you're taking a risk that maybe there's a sudden burst in demand. So you'll always want a little bit of a buffer. And when you look at those graphs that CloudWatch can put together in the dashboard, you could see how much delta there is. If it's too much, That's wasted cost. But if it's too little, are you going to meet demand? And seeing that over time, seeing if your usage changes, that therein lies what makes AppStream 2.0 different than your traditional on-premises pooled desktops, your pooled applications, because it's no longer about just having enough resources. It's having enough resources at scale. It's making sure that we're not spending when we don't need to, that the user experience is not compromised in any way. You're going to spend a lot more time in CloudWatch for AppStream than you will for WorkSpaces. Because with WorkSpaces, it's likely going to be this user says, my environment's slow. One of the first things you're going to do is check your CloudWatch metrics and see if the round trip time is just abhorrent, right? It's north of 200 milliseconds. How can I improve this? Or maybe at that point, if they're over 200 milliseconds, try WSP, because that is what Workspace's streaming protocol is really designed for. I'm getting into a lot of things that aren't necessarily security related, but you can understand now as an administrator when you're going to your InfoSec, this is why I need CloudWatch. It's really good reasons. It's cost, it's user experience, it's my operational excellence. There's a lot at stake here. So very important that we leverage this. Also with WorkSpaces, you have the CloudWatch events. I mean, you can use it to log all events and then set up automation from there. Great example of that is CloudWatch event. You capture the logon, right? It's called the WorkSpaces access event. You could then have a simple notification service that begins a fan-out architecture of automation. Maybe there's a Lambda function that's subscribed to SNS topic. It puts that JSON payload into DynamoDB as a holding place. And then maybe from there, you have other services chaining events. That's a really great use of CloudWatch events. And then, of course, if you want to see what your overall usage is, very easy with WorkSpaces. You could check the user connected metric you see. But with AppStream 2.0, it's a little different because we're really talking about concurrency of sessions and total availability in CloudWatch. Now we're talking about S3, getting that daily report. I need a output of all of the sessions and the applications that were accessed if it's an application streaming fleet. But all that is in S3. So you're going to go to S3, and then that's why I said, by the way, maybe you're using AWS Glue to stitch all those S3 reports together, and then you're using Athena to make your queries. And by the way, we have a CloudFormation template that can be executed from AppStream that will create all those predetermined type of reports that you would want to see sourcing that S3 data. It's not real time, your daily reports, right? It's after the fact that it's measured in 24-hour intervals. If you want real time, I highly recommend checking out our APIs and CLIs for describing sessions. If you need to be able to terminate sessions, again, that's also terminate API. We have all that information. I strongly advise you to check that out. And it's actually a very strong argument as a best practice to make sure that you have access to the command line where possible. And if you can't, perhaps Cloud Shell is a great alternative. You can check out AWS Cloud Shell, I think, which was just introduced at last year's reInvent. Okay, so I think we've come to the point now where we talk about customer success stories. And I love this customer here, Lunar Bank. You're not the biggest bank in the world, but you need to act like it. You need to scale really quickly and not have to worry about security. And what a great solution that they're able to enable their users to bring their own device. And now they don't have to stretch themselves. It's just very easy. They get on their device and they're working, and they're basically brought to the future. We talked about how you're a VDI administrator and then you're moving to this cloud. Well, what if you've never done VDI? What if you're just going from laptops to this? And that's one of the powers of AWS CUC is agility. It really doesn't take that long. And that's absolutely what happened here. Lunar blasts off into space. Just literally, they're moving in a speed that they didn't think they'd be able to. And you can't do that. You can't move fast unless security and compliance aren't baked into every level of these services. You can see here that they just implemented it with compliance already part of the solution. It made it so easy for them to enable remote work during a very, very stressful time. We're still living in this stressful time, this COVID-19 pandemic. But the important part is, if you're a customer of this bank, you're relieved that even though they're able to continue working and helping you as you need, that the data is not on their local devices. We just don't allow that. So that is a huge sigh of relief. And it allows them to immediately turn around, turnkey solution. Here's your desktops, your applications, and now we don't have to worry about it. But Amazon Workspaces, certainly, if you're very familiar with Amazon.com, which I think you are, all our Amazon employees, we added 3,000 workspaces per week during the initial COVID-19 outbreak. And it's been amazing internally watching the adoption of this and speaking with other Amazon and Amazon Web Services employees, how this has helped accelerate their ability to work, especially during a pandemic. It's just really been inspirational. But the point is, at its core, it's secure. LA County, very, very big client. Actually, before I worked at Amazon Web Services, I worked for a partner that was helping LA County. I'll never forget March of last year. Suddenly we had this mandate. We had to get 30,000 remote workers ramped up in a weekend to Amazon AppStream 2.0. And we did it. And I thought that was just that was a moment in my career where I looked at it, I said, well, this is amazing what we're doing. Imagine over a weekend, turning up 30,000 instances. It's not something that you would ever dream of doing at an on-premises type of deployment. So the power of the cloud, the reason you go to the cloud, the agility, it was just all on demonstration. And by the way, security never slowed us down. The security of this is what enabled it. I feel like a broken record here saying it over and over, but it's really important to stress. None of this is possible if it wasn't a secure solution from the ground up. Hankook Corporation, the tire company, they got their call center up in 2 weeks, save over $500,000 per month in real estate costs. And then Grubhub, obviously during the pandemic, we were using Grubhub quite a bit. So just knowing that I was working on a workspace and that they're working from workspaces, that's kind of exciting for me. So definitely couldn't do this without security in mind. Take a minute, folks. Check out these tools and resources. I was fortunate to be an author on both the best practices for deploying Amazon Workspaces and best practices for deploying Amazon AppStream 2.0. These best practices document we're regularly reviewing, updating as new features come out, but we are always taking feedback from customers. If you want to reach out to me on Twitter, review some of those best practices, give me some of your feedback. I'm happy to hear it. I don't take anything personally. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to take years and years of experience and distill it into these best practices guides. But I also say, don't forget the basics. Best practices for securing your VPC, still incredibly important. Review that, as well as the best practices for AWS key management services. Because if you're using workspaces, just get more familiar with it. Understand that we leverage grants for these keys. It's not the same as other AWS implementations with KMS. So understanding that as well, just the basics. And if you want to, check out directory services, check out security best practices for IAM. Anything we talked about today, those security best practices apply tenfold, right? So check those out too. There's just not enough room in one slide or two slides to cover it all. But if you heard it talked about today, check it out. I also wrote a blog on filtering internet traffic with Amazon Workspaces. That's why I was very excited to talk about AWS Network Firewall, but it applies to all firewalls. Smart card authentication continues to this day to be one of the biggest surprise in my experience. Just the amount of customers coming back with feedback, asking us, hey, can you give us some pointers on how to deploy smart cards? And by the way, I don't know if I captured it enough. Smart cards are supported on AppStream 2.0 as well. So don't let that stop you if you're non-persistent requirements. We're going to capture some of your questions here and get you some answers. It's been an absolute privilege to host this webinar with you today. I'm looking forward to hearing anything back from you folks. Thank you for your time. Have a great one.